say, Pastor, what else is on the menu? That's all you need, okay? It's all you need. Take your Bible with me. Turn to the book of Genesis, please. Genesis chapter 37 in your Bible tonight. Pastor Jeremy is planning to take me up camping up at Friend Park. When we had arranged this trip, I added a couple days to it because I wanted to get to see the area, and so I added a couple vacation days. I took a couple personal vacation days. I wanted to get to see the area a little bit, so we're going to go camping. And Pastor Jeremy told, he kind of had this plan and everything, and so I was excited because I thought, well, this is great. He's an experienced outdoorsman. Right. Search and rescue, please. Should I put the number in my phone? My phone won't work up there, will it? Wow, I'll tell you. Okay, just send the dogs after us. But we're planning to have a good time. You all live in a beautiful area, absolutely beautiful, and I appreciate so much just the sense of freedom that is here. I really appreciate that. Read an article today, because I read a lot of articles. I read an article today where Dr. Fauci, you know who Dr. Fauci is, the fearful little man, you know Dr. Fauci, right? That's what I call him. I call him the fearful little man. He is now proposing that we wear goggles. In addition, I'm serious, in addition to face coverings, that we now have to wear goggles. I'm telling you, Halloween has come early this year, folks. It really has. I just can't even imagine the thinking behind all of this. But lots of things happening in the news. By the way, National Geographic, we talked on Monday night. We quoted an article from USA Today a week and a half ago. National Geographic, the latest edition, has an article that mirrors the USA Today report article that says if in the future, if you want that, and here's how they put it in the article, if you want the privilege of attending a sporting event, they said you will be rewarded if you have the vaccine. You're rewarded for this. Those sentences I read were some of the most anti-American sentences I have ever read, okay? You're not rewarded for attending a sporting event. You're a free American. You can attend a sporting event of your own choice. It's not a matter of the government granting you some kind of reward because you are obedient. I'm against nations at all. I've been vaccinated. That's what's wrong with me. I've been, just kidding. I've been vaccinated, but I'm against anyone telling me I have to, okay? I'm against anyone telling me I have to. That is a personal choice that people are free to make and that people are free not to make. And we, as Americans, we need to really, in this day and time, we have got to defend our liberties or we will lose them. I'm absolutely convinced of that, and we have to stand up against this and against the insanity. Here's something I like about Wyoming. Here's something I like. You people are still sane. You act like Americans, and I want to thank you for that. I was preaching in Michigan a few weeks ago. Things have gone south in Michigan, let me tell you, at least with their governor. But we can't keep on with this. Let's look at Genesis 13. Before I read the scripture, I want to just remind you of the story of Joseph. Joseph was the son of Jacob's old age. And you'll recall that Joseph was a favored son. It's not really good for parents to show favoritism to one child, but Jacob had showed favoritism to Joseph and remember Joseph, he wove him a coat of many colors. You all remember that? Do you remember that from the Bible? Do you remember that from the Bible? Do you remember it from Dolly Parton's song about that? You're going to remember it somehow, okay. Had woven Joseph a coat of many colors, and that made his brothers jealous. But beyond that, something began to happen in young Joseph's life, and in his naivety, innocence, Joseph expressed to his brothers and to his parents that he was having dreams. He had strange dreams. In one dream, there were sheep standing upright in the field, and they bowed down to his sheaf of grain. In another dream, even the stars and the sun, everything bowed down to him. And the idea was that ultimately he would have some kind of very high authority. He reported these dreams, and his brothers envied him for the dreams, but his father was wise enough to think about it. And his father Jacob considered the dreams, he thought about them. He had made Joseph this coat of many colors. Because of the coat, because of the dreams, ultimately, his brothers were jealous of him. I was talking to someone today, and I mentioned that whenever there is a personality conflict, what we call personality conflict, between people, as a pastor, the first thing I look at is jealousy. Is jealousy somehow involved? Because jealousy is such an insidious emotion, and it is so all-pervasive, by the way, especially in the day of social media, where everybody gets jealous of what everybody else has and what everybody else is doing. Oh, but Pastor Monte, I saw on Facebook that so-and-so has such a wonderful life. You look at me. I'm a pastor. Nobody has a wonderful life. Everybody has problems, okay? Don't believe the Facebook fake. Walk away from that. But Joseph's brothers, the Bible says, they envied him. His father thought about the dreams. They envied him. Now, if you will, pick up this. The brothers went out to feed the flock. Joseph went out after them to seek them to feed the flock. As they saw Joseph coming toward them, the brothers hatched a plan. And their plan was this: we can do away with Joseph. Nothing will become of his dreams if we do away with him. They were that jealous. They were indeed bloodthirsty. And so in verse number 28, chapter 37, we'll pick up the story. They had captured Joseph when he came upon them. They had put him into a pit. The Bible says in verse 28, then there passed by Midianites, merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph to Egypt. This was their way of getting rid of their brother and of making a little money in the process of doing so. Verse 29, Reuben returned unto the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit, and he rent, or he tore his clothes, and he returned unto his brethren and said, the child is not I, whither shall I go? So Reuben was concerned about the fact that Joseph had been sold into slavery. And now note this, they took Joseph's coat that his father had lovingly made for him. They took Joseph's coat and killed a kid of the goats and dipped the coat in the blood. This is for evidence that they will show their father. Of course, they didn't want their father to know what they had done to Joseph, and so they're preparing their case for him. Verse 32, and they sent the coat of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, this have we found. Know now whether it be thy son's coat or no. Now, I want you to picture this for a moment. Aged Jacob is now confronted with a coat of many colors that he would have been well familiar with. It was a coat that he had made for his son. The boys have dipped this coat in blood, but now that blood is dried and they're journeying back to their father, they present him with the coat. And I can picture Jacob holding that coat in his hand. And as he holds that coat in his hands, I can picture his hands begin to tremble as his heart begins to break. I can picture Jacob as he begins to cry, understanding that this is the coat that he had made for his son, his favorite son, that this coat is evidence that something horrible has happened. Because over the brightness of the colors of that coat, there is now spattered blood. There are places where the blood stains are very deep, and as Jacob holds the coat, he envisions the death that must have befallen his son. It must have been painful, it must have been horrible, it must have been violent. Somehow his son was left to bleed out, and perhaps jackals or other animals of the night had ripped his body to pieces and carried it somewhere into the wilderness, because the only thing that is left of this horrendous accident, this horrible incident, is the coat of many colors that Joseph is holding in his hand. If you're Joseph, can you imagine what he must have felt? His son doubtless is gone, and all that is left is the coat. And so they asked him in verse 32, know now whether it be thy son's coat or no. And he knew it, and he said, it is my son's coat. He was correct about that. We know that from the text of the Bible. But look what else he said. An evil beast hath devoured him. Joseph is without doubt rent in pieces. Let's pause there for a moment. Jacob got the first part right. This is my son's coat. The second part, he looked at the evidence and he said, this is my son's coat without doubt. There can be no question because I hold hard evidence in my hand, a bloodied coat. There can be no doubt in pieces. And ladies and gentlemen, nothing could have been further from the truth. Now, before I sound judgmental, because I don't want to do that, about Jacob, let us be clear. If I were in Jacob's place and held the coat in my hands, I would have made the same assumption. If I were in Jacob's place and seeing the evidence that I had, The coat that I had woven for my son, now stained with the blood of what I presumed to be my son. If I held that in my hand, I would come to the same conclusion that doubtless my son met with a painful and bitter end at the hand of some kind of beast or wild animal. And I think it's fair to say that every person in this room would come to the same conclusion. However, nothing could have been further from the truth. I remember years ago, I decided to take up deer hunting. Now, gentlemen, let me make a statement. I was born to be an outdoorsman, but not a very good one. I dabble in outdoors things, but I decided to take up deer hunting, and so I did what every man does who's going to take up deer hunting. I subscribed immediately to Field and Stream, because Field and Stream tells you how to get the big bucks, and I needed to know how to get the big bucks. I read several issues of this. I read the special deer issue that comes out, the buck issue that comes out in the fall. I studied these things. And then I have a pastor, assistant pastor on my staff at the time. His father, who is a genuine hunter, lives in southern Indiana, volunteered that the three of us would go together and we could go hunting. And I was so excited. I was excited because I had read Field and Stream, and I knew, according to the magazine, exactly where the big bucks would be. You say, Pastor Monte, how does the magazine know? I don't know, but I'm assuming the bucks read the magazine because they're going to be there. And so the magazine explained that at this particular time of the season, the big bucks were going to be way back in the woods. And so I was ready to march way back in the woods. We went down at dark 30 in the morning, the three of us together. And Mr. Lopez was his last name. Mr. Lopez was going to position us in places where we would await the sun to arise. And I knew that when the sun peeked over that horizon and the shadows began to flee at the light of the dawn, that I would look across this little where I was sitting, and there would probably be 4 or 5 large bucks, and I would take my pick and shoot them and be out in the woods by 10 o'clock in the morning. Nothing could have been more wrong. We walked into the woods 50 yards from the truck, and Mr. Lopez said, in the darkness of night, he said, go down and sit on the edge of that hill up to the tree. Now, wait a minute. My heart sank. We were only 50 yards from the truck. I'm arguing in my mind. I was not going to argue with him, but I think the big bucks are back in the woods because I heard about it. Be here in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, but I didn't argue. I just went down kind of crestfallen and sat behind this tree, kind of on a hillside. They went deep into the woods. I was getting bitter, by the way. He took his son-in-law deep into the woods. That assistant pastor's going to get a deer, and I'm not going to get anything. But I'd had a deer before. I'd never had a deer. How many remember that, your first deer? Oh, look at that. I've got men and women raising their hands. God bless Wyoming. Okay, let me just say that. Okay, let me say it publicly. And so I was seated there. The sun came up. There was nothing but squirrels. Aren't squirrels irritating when you're deer hunting? Don't you want to just shoot squirrels when you're deer hunting? Because you think something's there, but it's not. And 8 o'clock turned to 9 o'clock, 9 o'clock turned to 10 o'clock. We'd made an agreement that at 11:30 they were going to come out of the woods where the big bucks were. They were going to come out and walk on the trail, and they said, don't shoot us when we come. It'll be about 11:30. So 11 o'clock rolls around, then a little bit after 11 o'clock rolls around, and all of a sudden I heard something. I heard scurrying noise. I thought it was those two guys coming early. I turned and looked up the hill. Now listen to this. There was a doe. We said, Pastor Monte, you wanted a buck. At this, okay, I'll take anything at this point. And that doe was a great distance away, but I'm knowing that we only have a few more minutes left of hunting and I'm done. So I thought, you know what, I'll shoot at this. Now, in Indiana at that time, we could only use shotguns, okay, with a slug. That was the law at that time. And it had to be 75 yards away. And so I put my bead, as best I could, on that doe. It was so far away that the bead covered up the doe, okay? You understand what I'm saying? And so I was... And everyone in this room who's ever gone deer hunting, you know my heart was pounding like crazy right now. I was excited and yet I was afraid. You say, Pastor Monte, afraid of what? Because as soon as I squeeze that trigger, there's going to be a loud noise. If I don't get the deer, they will know that I shot at something. Nothing more embarrassing than to have fired your gun and to have missed with friends. By the way, the wilderness is the most embarrassing place in the world. It is better when you're by yourself for things that happen in the wilderness, because then only you and God know. And so I squeezed the trigger, boom! And up that thing jumped and ran away. And it was so far in the distance, my heart just sank. And now I'm embarrassed on top of it. But wait, there's more. Over the crest of the hill, I hear a noise. And there is a herd of deer coming over the crest of the hill. Now, I was covered in camo. I looked like a big, awkward bush. I was covered in camo. I turned, and here come these doe. Now, by the way, you say, Pastor Monte, did you wait for the buck that was following the doe? I did, and there wasn't one. But these deer were coming straight at me. They didn't see me, okay? I thought I was going to be run over by these deer. And so I thought, well, I missed that one. So I'm following one. I picked out the biggest one I could. Boom! It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. She crumpled. Are there children in the room? Children, don't cry. You're Wyoming children. You don't care about this. The front legs of the deer crumpled, and she began to tumble down the hill. So, Pastor, what did you do? She was tumbling down the hill, crumpled front legs, but since it was still moving, I shot it again. Boom! And then it fell down into the little creek bottom. I was so elated. I was so happy. And I went down there, and then by this time, the other two guys, they're running over, and they're like, you get it? Yeah, I said, I got it. This is wonderful, I got it. And then Pastor Lopez's father, Mr. Lopez, said, so I heard 3 shots. I said, all right. I said, this one has 2. By the way, I hit it both times. Not in the best spots in the world, but hey, okay, hit it both times. He said, what's the 3rd shot for? I said, oh, that was for this deer that was way over there, and it got away. He said, well, how do you know it got away? I said, because it just jumped up and got away. He said, I think you got that one too. So we walked up there to the approximate place. By this time, I don't even know where it was. And we found a blood spot. It wasn't just a blood spot, folks. It was like someone had taken spray paint and spray painted probably 25 or 30 feet. And then there was the 2nd deer, which was really the 1st deer. I was so excited. I was excited. I said, I got 2 deer! I got 2 deer! I got 2 deer! He said, shut up! It's illegal. I know no one in Wyoming would ever do this, but I gave the other guy the deer, and he tagged it up. I know you people don't do stuff like that because it's tacky. So I was convinced that I had missed the 1st deer, but nothing could have been further from the truth. Now, I had the evidence because I had seen in that split second that deer ran away, and so I took the other one, but nothing could be further from the truth. May I suggest something about life? Things are not always as they appear. We have a tendency to build cases in our lives as to what is good and what is bad. Now, categories of good and bad are useful, okay? We have to have categories by which we judge and discern things. Categories of good and bad are very useful, but sometimes we use our intuition to determine that a series of circumstance in our life is fundamentally bad. Very, very quick to pass judgment on any particular thing that befalls us. And so if we go to work and the boss yells at us or something, we will view that as very, very bad. If something comes into our lives that we weren't expecting, we might view it as bad. On the contrary wise, there are some things that we view as very, very good. And all day long we make these value judgments. But may I suggest that the evidence that we have is often incomplete. Jacob held in his hands the evidence, but he came to a wrong conclusion. He said, no doubt, without a doubt, my son is rent or torn in pieces. The problem is this: things are not always as they appear because my perspective is flawed. It is human. It is self-centered. I cannot see the bigger thing that God is doing. And so something that I judge in my life as bad or horrible may be God doing something that is far bigger than I know. My mind cannot comprehend the totality of God's great plan. Here's what I do. I jump to a conclusion when negative circumstances enter my life. Sometimes I even theorize that for some reason, God is against me. Now, I want to put you back into the story in the Bible for a moment. Jacob is holding what are the last remains of his son, the bloodied coat. Jacob has come to a conclusion. Jacob will say this, I will go down to the grave mourning my son. And he actually allowed bitterness to build in his heart. Don't think for a moment that Jacob's bitterness was not, at least in part, directed toward God. See, we are all human in this room, okay? And by the way, it's good to be transparent in church. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but here's something I know because I know people. Here's something I know because I know me. There are times when something unexplainable and very negative happens in my life. And even though I'm a pastor, in the back of my mind, I wonder, where is God? Or is this negative circumstance evidence of God's providence against me? Now, I know the Bible teaches different from that. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But I'm a human being too, just like you are. And so I can have something happen in my life, and I wonder, Lord, why did this happen? But if it's something really bad, I might think to myself, Lord, have you turned against me? As Jacob clutched to his chest that bloodied coat, he looked at that, and it appeared to be the evidence of God's cruel providence. That somehow this one that Jacob had loved above all of his other sons was now gone and dead, and there was nothing he could do except to clutch that coat and grow bitter. But I might remind you, we know because we have the Bible in our hand, that things are not always as they appear. Put yourself in Jacob's shoes, though, and this is all he has left of his son. So things are not always as they appear. But secondly, a second observation is this. God sometimes hides his working from his best servants. God sometimes hides his working from his best servants. Pastor Monte, I love the Lord, and so every time something bad happens in my life, a horrible circumstance, God surely should right away explain to me what he's doing. But when I read my Bible, that's not how God acts. In fact, the entire book of Job is dedicated to the idea that Job lost everything, and only at the end, if ever, could he ever have known what had transpired. God sometimes hides his working from his best of servants. Think about Jacob with me for a moment. Jacob knew intimate fellowship with God. Preacher, where do you find that? Genesis 32. Jacob wrestled with the Lord. Remember that? His name was changed to Israel. It was changed from Jacob, supplanter, to Israel, prince with God. Jacob played a key role in God's plan for Israel and for all of history. In Genesis 35, the same promise that had been given to Abraham in Genesis 12 was repeated to Jacob. And Jacob would be one of the progenitors of the Jewish people. And that covenant, by the way, that covenant, which is an unconditional covenant, which will be fulfilled to the Jewish people in the future, that covenant was given through Jacob. He was something special in God's economy. You would think, well, Pastor Jacob, shouldn't God have whispered in his ear, hey, Jacob, don't worry about that blood you're holding. Joseph's okay, and you're going to see something big happen. But you notice something? God did not do that. Can I tell you this? God is not obligated to tell us the reason why. Not obligated. We would love to know the reason why because we're curious and God made us that way, but he's not obligated to do so. God could have revealed his plan for Joseph to Jacob, but he chose not to do so. Some said, Pastor Monte, does God always have a purpose? Look at me, yes, he does. Always. Does God always reveal that purpose in this life? The answer to that is no. The Apostle Paul put it this way. He said, but now we see through a glass darkly and then face to face. 33 years of being a pastor, and you're a preacher here, I don't know, decades of being a pastor, man of God. Preacher, you have some questions, don't you, when you get to heaven to ask the Lord? I have some questions. There are some things I don't understand, but here's the good news. When we see him face to face, we shall know even as we are known. There is a purpose, there is an answer. But God decided to withhold this information from Jacob for reasons known only to himself. Now listen to this. As Jacob's holding that bloodied coat, for reasons known only to himself, God decided to withhold this information from Jacob for decades. For decades. The embittered Jacob. He said he would go down to his grief and mourning. We can't possibly know all of the mind of God in giving us a bloody coat, but we can learn not to be bitter. Can I share one with you, if I may? Years ago, I think now going on 14 or 15 years ago, Kelly and I were expecting what would have been our third child. We were super excited about that. He would have been a little boy. And Kelly had easy, basically, I shouldn't say this. Kelly had had an easy pregnancy. You know, that'll get me slapped if she ever listened to the cassette tape. There's no such thing. But she had, there's just no way to say this, okay? It was relatively trouble-free. And so we assumed that this third one would be just fine. And she went to all the doctor's visits, and the baby was developing, and everything seemed like it was just fine. And she had a regular scheduled visit that she was going to go to, so I was at work that day at the church, and so she just went to those visits and by herself, and it was a Wednesday. And when I came home from the office, she was sitting at the table. She had been crying. And right away I said to her, I said, Kelly, what's wrong? And she said, the doctor says I've lost the baby. I think the baby was 16 weeks, 17 weeks, something like that. The umbilical cord somehow had got wrapped around the baby's neck. And I remember we sat there at the kitchen table, and both of us just cried. I called a staff member, said I wouldn't be at Wednesday night prayer meeting, and I stayed, just wept. So, Pastor Monte, why did God allow that to happen? No. I'm just being honest with you. I don't know. I remember weeping at the kitchen table with her for a long time, and as I wept, I must have a purpose. But I don't know what that purpose is. I can't tell you tonight what that purpose is. That weekend, she had to, of course, have the baby's remains removed from her body, and so that would happen the following Monday. To me, that was a long time to wait, but that was when they scheduled that to happen. And I'll never forget, as a pastor, sitting in my chair on the platform, with my wife behind me in the choir on that Sunday morning, singing praises to God with our dead baby inside of her. I'll never forget that. I'll never forget the strength and the courage that my wife had to do that. And then on Monday, they took care of that at the hospital. I'll never forget that. But do I know a reason why? I'm going to be frank with you. I don't know, but there is a reason, and one day I will. I don't know what the reason is, but one day I will know. God sometimes hides his reasoning from his servants. I want to give you another idea from this passage, that negative circumstances do not necessarily mean a final negative conclusion. Now, you all know the story. Joseph was sold away into Egypt. And Joseph rose very rapidly to become number 2, essentially, in the kingdom, or number 3. There would have been Potiphar, then there would have been the Pharaoh, and Joseph was right beneath Potiphar. And you'll understand that Joseph rose to prominence, but then there was that little conflict with Potiphar's wife. And then Joseph was plunged again into prison. And the events of Joseph's life probably span in Egypt around 40 years of time. And Joseph went up, Joseph went down, Joseph went up again. But in the final analysis, Joseph interpreted a dream. And the interpretation of the dream allowed the officials of Egypt to gather enough supplies for a period of famine that would hit the land. And it was Joseph, having interpreted a dream and having made preparation, that frankly then saved the then known world of the Middle East. It was Joseph who did this. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that is a bigger plan. But think with me, Jacob is back in Canaan land. Jacob has saved that bloodied coat. He put it away somewhere, and every once in a while, when he was reminiscing about his son, would take it out and look at that blood-spattered garment. Jacob had no idea that that son he assumed to be dead would actually save the then known world from famine. You see, sometimes we come to a negative conclusion about something. Pastor Monte, this and this and this and this happened in my life, and my life is ruined. It may not be. By the way, let me be clear about something tonight. Joseph's brothers sinned in selling him to slavery. How many know that? Did you know that somebody's sin against you cannot thwart God's plan for your life? A lot of things happen in this world. A lot of things happen. Well, Pastor Monte, so-and-so, my spouse, ruined my life. He or she ran off with somebody else. Listen to me. Those things aren't within the will of God when they happen. But you as the victim do not have to have your life ruined. Because there is a God in heaven into whose hands you can place the situation. And you can say, God, here it is. And though you may be the victim of someone's negative behavior toward you, it does not ruin God's plan or God's will for your life. A negative circumstance does not necessarily mean there will be a negative final conclusion. I think we do well to remind ourselves Romans 8:28 is still in the Bible. And Romans 8:28 teaches that work together for good. To them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. Some years ago, I think now, almost 10 years ago, my foster son and his wife were expecting what would be their second child. They were really happy about it. They've got a really nice son, a beautiful boy, Eli. They were excited to have this second child coming into their life. And so he told me, of course, when they started telling people, said, we're expecting our second child. Man, Kelly and I were happy. We were thrilled about that. It's into this. I don't remember how many. They went to some kind of thing, and the doctors discovered something that wasn't quite right. And so they did a little more research into the matter, and they said, Benny and Jenny, they said, Mr. Bravo, they said, there's probably a 1 in 4 chance that your baby will be born Down syndrome. The doctors asked if they wanted that test that tells for sure, that genetic test, and they said, no, we don't want that test. We don't want that. Because the baby will be born regardless, so we don't want to know till the baby is born. So Benny left that appointment. He came right to my office. He sat down. He said, hey, preach. He said, the doctor said 1 in 4 chance that this baby's going to be born with Down syndrome. But he said this. He said, I know that God always hears you, and if you will pray about it, the baby will be just fine. By the way, a lot of pressure to put on somebody. And so I did pray about it. As the time drew closer for the baby to be born, my prayers became. They didn't know anything from ultrasounds. They couldn't tell anything that way. And so we would know when the child was born what the situation was. That's when we would find out. And I remember not only praying to the Lord, but I think I can just tell you everything, okay, because you're a good church. I not only prayed to the Lord, I argued with the Lord. I know none of you have ever been that carnal. But I argued with the Lord. And I said stuff like this, Lord, if this baby's not healthy, they're going to doubt you exist. Lord, if you don't pull one off on this baby, and if this baby's not healthy, they might fall out of church. Lord, they might stop loving you and serving you. Lord, there's all kinds of... Lord, you have to show yourself mighty. You have to show yourself powerful. God, you have to do something. Lord, you have to answer my prayer. I mean, that's how I felt about it. The day of the birth came. We went to the hospital. Jenny gave birth to what appeared to me to be a perfect little baby. Shortly after the baby was born, we were allowed to come into the room. I looked at that little newborn baby, and I was so relieved because I thought that baby looks perfect to me. Why, I'm not a doctor. I understand all that. There's something about the position of the ears. They look fine to me, but there's something about that the doctors could see right away. And after a few moments, my wife and I were in the room. The doctor said to Benny, he said, we know now that this baby has Down syndrome. We have to take the baby for additional tests, something with the heart, some issues with the heart and other health things, and they took the baby out of the room. I'm going to tell you folks something, to be real honest with you. I'm mad at the Lord. I was at that moment. I'm just telling you, okay? I'm a human being. I'm just telling you. I was mad at the Lord. And I left the hospital room. My wife stayed there. I went out into the hospital yard somewhere by myself, and I told the Lord, I said, Lord, I said, if they drop out of church, it's your fault. I really did. I really did. I said, Lord, if they turn their backs on you, Lord, it's all your fault, Lord. You could have answered this prayer, but you didn't. And I was really frustrated with the Lord. I was really worried for my son Benny. I was worried for him. About a week and a half after that, and I was frustrated. You say, Pastor Monte, when did you get right with God? I didn't yet in the story. About a week and a half after that, I was still very frustrated. I knew Benny was going through a hard time, and that made my frustration even deeper. About a week and a half after that, he called me on the phone. He said, hey, preach. He said, I've been listening to some of your messages online. And he said, God told me something. I said, what is that, Benny? He said, God told me that if anyone in the world is supposed to have a special needs child, it should be us. My wife's a nurse. We have great insurance. He's a regional director of loss prevention over 450 Walmart stores. Makes really, really good money. He said, if God's going to give a special child to anyone, it just makes sense that God would give that child to us. Now watch. When he said those words, I was so convicted about my personal lack of faith, about my personal doubt of God. This was 9 years ago. I can remember it like it was yesterday, this phone call. He's like, preacher, we're just going to embrace this baby because this is what God has given us. This is part of his plan for our lives. And as he's saying this, tears are coming down my cheeks. I'm trying my voice not to crack, but conviction is hitting my heart. Let me fast forward for you 9 years. I don't know if anyone in this room has ever had the privilege. Did you hear what I just said? The privilege of loving a special needs child. That is a privilege. I don't know if anyone in this room has ever seen the joy. You know what? Those kids are never sad. They're always happy. You can't say that for your kids. They're always happy. Do you know that little Macy gets excited over the smallest thing that's done for her? My wife watches her when she's done with school. Kelly picks her up from school, and I'll come in about 5 o'clock from the church or whatever. And every time the front door opens, we have a driveway alarm, she can hear that. The front door opens, and that little girl, now 9 years old, she runs out the front door, and she gives me a huge hug. And you know what she says? She says, my preacher. My preacher. I'm going to tell you something. There's a God in heaven. See, well, Pastor, it's just awful, those circumstances. And the world would say, well, she should have an amniocentesis test, and if she had determined that child was going to be special needs, she could have had that child aborted. Shut your mouth. That child is the apple of my eye. And I'm telling you something, Pastor, everybody knows that's a negative thing. No, not unless you've experienced that. She has taught me more about life. She has taught me more about a right attitude than any person I have ever met. And she loves with a love that is as pure and as real and as genuine. Here's what I'm saying to you. We are foolish when we look at a set of circumstances and we say, to paraphrase Jacob, no doubt this is a horrible thing. We don't know that. And in Jacob's case, when he said, no doubt my son is rent in pieces somewhere. No, Jacob, you're wrong. God is doing something far bigger than you know. I've learned something about life, and it's about time I learned it. We need to learn to embrace the bloody coat that God gives us. We need to learn to embrace it and understand there's something bigger that God is doing. Do not demand God to show us what it is, because he may choose not to show us what it is. But there comes a time when we need to embrace our circumstances and say, God, I don't know what you're doing, but God, I love you. God, I trust you. And God, you have everything under your control. Years ago, a young man got on my Sunday school bus many years ago for church. He came from a dysfunctional home. His father was an abuser. When the children would misbehave, one of his methods of punishment was to put their hands into a toaster and to turn on the toaster. Now, never enough to leave a mark, but certainly enough to burn them as far as the feeling of it. I only learned this, by the way, after he was grown. Had I known this when he was coming to church, I would have dealt with it with the law. He lived in filth. His mother had mental problems, and she was not functional as a mother. His father was a stepfather and completely negligent. His biological father was in prison for having attempted to drown him in a kiddie pool when he was 2 years old. The boy's home was so filthy that he would bring his clothing on the Sunday school bus for my wife to launder. We started buying, as he got older, we started buying him toiletries and things because no one was providing simple basics like deodorant. We started taking care of the young man, and the day came when his mother had divorced the father and the stepfather and packed up everything in a van. They were going to move to a distant state. The boy said, he was 14 at the time, he said, "I don't want to do that." He said, "Can I stay with the preacher?" His mom drove him to my house, dropped him off at my house, and drove away. And that was the end of that. 14 years old. I just say that was a challenge. It was a huge challenge. But it was something that I would repeat in a heartbeat. Because as that boy grew, he had a lot of issues from his background, from his family background. But as that boy grew, God got a hold of his heart. I remember sometimes, because of his background, he would say stuff to me like, "Preacher, why was my family such a mess? Why was it so dysfunctional? Preacher, why did I have to go through all of this? And why did God?" And he'd get frustrated like a kid would. "Why did God have to give me parents like this and stand all of this?" And I would say, "James, I don't know the answer," because I didn't know the answer. But I said, there has to be an answer. That boy was very mischievous, and I can't go into stories for legal reasons. Boy was very mischievous, but today that young man is the pastor of the North Stone Baptist Church in Pensacola, Florida. He has a beautiful wife and 3 beautiful boys. And as an adult, he said this. He said, "Preach, you taught me to embrace my circumstances and to trust God." Can I suggest none of us is perfect at that? But embracing the bloodied coat. Whatever it is in your life, I don't know what that looks like, but embracing that bloody coat. Understanding that God has a purpose and He is going to accomplish that purpose despite the evidence to the contrary. Understanding that I jump the gun when I judge a circumstance. Jacob jumped the gun. "Oh, no doubt my son is rent in pieces. Here's the coat. Here's the blood. This is all the evidence I need of a cruel providence of God against my life." Nothing could have been further from the truth. Why don't we wisen up? And when God hands us a bloodied coat, I know, now I'm not suggesting tears shouldn't fall, because we're human, we're emotional. Tears can fall. There's nothing wrong with tears. There's nothing wrong with a heartache when something horrible happens. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not suggesting you be stoic, but what I'm suggesting you do is that rather than judge the circumstance immediately as some cruel providence of God, that you say, "I'm going to lift my eyes above the tears. God, I'm going to function beyond the heartbreak that I feel right now. God, I'm going to be driven to your word. God, I'm going to claim Romans 8:28. God, I can't see it, and all the evidence, if put of law, would say God must hate me, God's punishing me, God's doing this, and this to me. That's the evidence, but God, I'm going to trust you because you are a loving God. And God, I'm going to embrace the bloodied coat." Years ago, I preached this message at Southwest Church in Home City. It was a Wednesday night. There was an ice storm. There were probably 600 people in the auditorium. Those people come to church no matter what down there. I preached this message. Pastor came and gave the invitation. There were people at the altar praying. And there was a lady praying over here, and he gave a long invitation. And he stepped back from the pulpit, and I'm standing over here, and he said to me, he said, "Monte," he said, "see that lady praying over there? Her husband used to be the custodian. Massive, massive, huge church. I suppose this would have been 50 or 60 feet high. He said he died a month ago when he fell from a ladder changing lights in this auditorium. He said the place where she's kneeling is the place where her husband died, and she's embracing a bloodied coat. Can I tell you, that's really hard. That's really, really hard. But somehow, if we really believe in God, while tears were flowing, there's an embracing of circumstances. The music continued to play, and people were making decisions, people were praying. Pastor came and said, "See that girl over there?" He said this with tears in his eyes. He said, "That's my granddaughter." Her hands were positioned funny, I could see. She had walked down with some kind of a limp. He said, "A year and a half ago, my granddaughter was perfectly healthy. She got bit by some kind of a tick, and something went to her brain, and it caused her hands to change and her walk to change. She could no longer speak, and doctors said she never would again." And she was weeping at the altar, and the pastor was crying, and Pastor Davison, Sam Davison, some know him. Pastor Sam said, "Brother Monte, she's embracing the bloodied coat because through this all, she still loves God." You say, "Pastor, can you explain why God allows these things?" I can't explain it, but can I tell you something? He has a bigger purpose. There's something greater beyond this. So, as a young man, my parents, it was not a Christian home, but I grew up in a stable home. When I was 9 years old, I remember my dad, I remember this, he was going to do his second job. He'd been a school teacher for Minneapolis Public School. He parked cars at a parking lot for the park board of Minneapolis, and he was sitting on the third step in the basement, like taking off his shoes. He was going to put on his winter boots because he was going to his second job being outside. And I remember he tried to put on his right boot, and he pulled it up to get his foot in the boot. He looked at his foot, and his foot was swollen. He decided to stay home. Long story short, a few months later, he was diagnosed with colon cancer. This was back in 1976. In 1976, the treatment for colon cancer was pretty rough. Remember the cobalt treatments and things of that nature that people, chemotherapy, not refined as it is today. And as a young boy, I watched my dad go from a healthy, strong individual to emaciated. Finally, they brought a hospital bed into our home. I remember my dad would try to get around with a wheelchair and a walker. By the way, he didn't quit his job at teaching at Minneapolis Public Schools. He'd carry a wheelchair. They offered him a disability, and my dad said, "I won't take money for nothing." As long as he could, he taught school from a wheelchair. Finally, he couldn't do that anymore. He was bedridden and at home. I watched him go from a very strong man to a man that was emaciated physically. I watched as my mother tried to keep it together with both my twin brother and myself and dealing with Dad's illness. Finally, it became too much. He was brought to the hospital. I remember those were the days when kids didn't get to visit in hospitals. There were age limits, but my dad was dying, and the doctors knew he had probably less than 2 or 3 days to live, and so the doctor said, "You need to bring your boys up, and they need to say goodbye to their dad." When you're 12 years old, that's a really hard thing. My mother didn't say that we were going up to say goodbye to Dad. She didn't, but to say that. We got in the car, we drove up there, we went into the room. I can see, you can still remember certain things. I can remember this. Walked in the room, and my dad was all hooked up to all kinds of things. There was the tubes coming in and tubes coming out. I thought, well, maybe if they keep him hooked up to those tubes, they could keep him alive that way. I didn't know, and I didn't understand. Do y'all remember the show The Waltons? TV show The Waltons? The Waltons TV show was playing in that room. I can remember that. And my brother and I sat there, and my dad was in horrible condition. It was awkward. It was awkward. We were there to say goodbye, but nobody wanted to say goodbye. So we watched TV together, and we chit-chatted together for a little bit. When it was time to go, my mom said, "Give your dad a hug and tell him you love him." And I did, leaning over the bed. When I tell this story, I can still feel my dad's arms around me. I can still feel him holding me as if he never wanted to let go. And I remember turning my back and walking out of that room, and in my mind knowing I would never see him alive again. Pretty rough circumstance for a 12-year-old boy. My dad, right before he died, told my mother, he said, "Dorothy, don't let the kids continue in the public school system of Minneapolis." He was a teacher there. He didn't like the direction of the schools. He said, "Promise me on my deathbed that you'll put them in some kind of religious school." It didn't matter what religion, because we didn't go to church. Dad just thought a private education would be a better education. My mother made that promise. And so when that school year rolled around, my mother decided to enroll us in a Catholic school, because Dad's family had been Catholic, and there were lots of those in Minneapolis. Funny thing, when she started calling the various schools, none of them answered the phone. My mom, she went to the Roman Catholic neighbors across the street, very faithful. They went to Mass every day. She said, Mr. Tiffany, is this some kind of Catholic holiday? They don't answer the phone in schools. Tiffany said, "No, not a holiday at all. I don't know why they're not answering the phones, but why are you calling the schools?" My mother explained, "Well, I'm going to enroll the boys in a Catholic school because their dad wanted them in a private school." And Mr. Tiffany, a dedicated Roman Catholic man, he looked at my mother and he said, "Don't enroll your boys at a Catholic school." He said, "Enroll them at Fourth Baptist Christian School on the north side." We'd never heard of it. My mother wrote it down, called the independent, fundamental, Bible-believing Baptists. We didn't know what any of that meant. Called them up and said, I'd like to enroll my boys in this school. We show up for an interview. In the high school, you had to have a salvation testimony to be enrolled into the school. Salvation from what? I didn't know. I'd never heard these words before. But the guy who did the interviews, he's on vacation. So a secretary just said, "Are you Christians?" And of course we're Christians, because everybody in America is a Christian. Because we didn't know. So the lady just checked marked the box. And in a few weeks, I was in a school where I would hear the saving gospel of Jesus Christ for the first time in my life. In a few weeks, I was under conviction. After a couple months of attending that school, the conviction was so strong in my heart that I remember the day that I got down on my knees in my bedroom as an 8th grade young person, and I said, "Lord, I'm not saved. Please save me. Please forgive me. I believe Jesus died for my sins. I believe that he rose again. Please save me." You know, according to Romans 10:13, the Bible says, "Whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved." He saved me in that moment. Within less than a year of that time, he called me to preach. And here's what I'm doing today. Now let me tell you something. For a 12-year-old boy to lose his dad is a pretty hard thing. But God had something bigger. And it was through that I got saved, my brother got saved, my mother got saved. My older brother, 14 years older than I was a surprise. My older brother, 14 years older than I, he got saved. His wife got saved. We have cousins who have come to know Christ as Savior. Here's what I'm saying, folks. Sometimes that thing that looks like the worst possible event, God is doing something bigger than we know. And it's okay to cry, and it's okay to have a heartbreak, but the best thing in the world you can do is embrace that bloody coat and trust in him. Embrace it and trust in him. Though tears may flow, embrace it and trust in him. Jacob would live long enough to see that grand statement, "No doubt an evil beast hath rent him in pieces," was not true. Jacob would live long enough to see his son, his favorite son, had saved the world from famine. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the grace of God. And that is why Paul said, we know that all things work together for good to them who love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. Father, thank you for a story in the Bible that illustrates how we are as human beings, so quick to judge and evaluate our circumstance and to classify it in a negative light. And then sometimes, Lord, in our bitterness, become angry and upset with you, to believe somehow that you're being cruel or you're punishing us in some way. Father, I pray for every person in this room that holds a bloodied coat, that they would learn this night to embrace that, though tears may fall, though a heart may be broken, to embrace that thing, whatever it is, and to believe and to know that you have a bigger plan, that all things do work together for good, and that one day, maybe not now, but one day we will know. Help us, Lord, to learn better how to trust in you, we pray. In Jesus' name. Let's stand, please, everyone. We'll stand together. We're going to sing All to Jesus I Surrender.